Leaning forward into her computer screen, Caroline Bradshaw watched the figures as they moved over the spreadsheet with much interest. Time had passed without anyone noticing. The faint glow of the streetlights outside her window reminded her that night had long since fallen. With only a few dim lights flickering down the corridor, the accounting office where she worked was now all but empty. She let out a sigh and rubbed her temples gently. Before checking the time, it was beyond 7 o'clock. She had remained late again. She quickly slid her laptop into her handbag after snapping it shut. She pictured her younger sister, Vanessa, and her mother, Elizabeth. Most likely they were anticipating her return home for dinner. Caroline stepped outside and heard the office door click softly behind her. She inhaled deeply, allowing the cool Cleveland night air to fill her lungs. Even though she was still feeling quite tired, she was unable to recall when she had taken a whole day off. Bills continued mounting, work never ended, and she was never able to take a break due to family obligations. The living room's cozy glow greeted Caroline as she got home, but no one was there to welcome her. The only sounds in the quiet were the muffled TV and the faint yellow light from the kitchen. "Are you home, Caroline?" From the kitchen came her mother's voice. Elizabeth emerged in the doorway with a soft grin on her face, despite her mild fatigue. "I saved you a plate in the refrigerator, but Vanessa and I ate earlier." Caroline grinned and put her suitcase down before entering the kitchen. Vanessa, Caroline's younger sister, was sitting at the table, barely registering her presence as she was absorbed in her phone. She just looked up, waved half-heartedly, and returned her attention to her screen. Caroline didn't hold Vanessa responsible. She got it. Since their father's departure 10 years ago, it had been just the three of them. They had all adapted to his absence in their own unique ways. Jonathan Bradshaw, her father, had long since left their house. He continued to communicate at first, but over time, the calls decreased in frequency until eventually ceasing completely. Caroline took over as the family's main provider after that day. Elizabeth, her mother, had been a teacher, but she had retired early from teaching because of her poor health, occasionally working part-time. Regarding her younger sister, Vanessa, Caroline hardly ever witnessed her actually trying to find a job, despite her constant claims to the contrary. Caroline, however, never voiced any complaints. For her, family meant making sacrifices. She put in a lot of work because of this, making enough money to sustain the three of them. She was responsible for everything: groceries, utilities, and rent. Caroline moaned quietly as she reheated her food and considered the bills for this month. Her savings were running low, and she had spent more than she had anticipated. "Our living expenses have gone up significantly in recent years, Mom. Do you recall if we made any unexpected purchases?" Caroline asked in a light-hearted manner. Elizabeth raised her teacup to her lips and shrugged. "Dear, it's easy to forget as you age. Perhaps the first made some unneeded purchases," Vanessa said, without raising her head from her phone. "I think I did some stress shopping." Caroline gave her sister a quick glance, but Vanessa avoided eye contact. She gave a soft sigh. Caroline knew in her heart that her sister and mother were not as concerned about money as she was. To them, there was nothing to worry about as long as Caroline was around to handle it. However, it wasn't so easy for Caroline. She forced a grin, reminding herself that family was everything. Even though she was still frustrated, who would look after them if she didn't? She was unaware that that belief would be destroyed in the most agonizing way in a matter of days. The next few days went by as usual. Silently bearing the burden of her family on her tiny shoulders, Caroline continued to be preoccupied with her profession. She never thought of giving up, no matter how worn out she was. However, everything changed with a simple phone call one day. Caroline was in her office that day, going through a pile of filled-out paperwork. Suddenly, her phone vibrated on the desk and showed an unidentified number. She pondered ignoring it at first, but changed her mind because it might be a client. She took it up. "Hi, I'm Caroline Bradshaw." Through the telephone came a strong male voice. "Today, Miss Bradshaw. From New Life Insurance, I'm phoning. I wanted to inform you that we successfully completed the beneficiary update for your life insurance policy." Caroline scowled. "An advantageous update. Yes, a request was made last month. Our records indicate that Miss Elizabeth Bradshaw and Miss Vanessa Bradshaw are the new beneficiaries. Caroline's heart was pounding rapidly. No, that's not feasible. I didn't ask for this modification. There must be an error. There was a tiny hesitancy on the other end, Miss Bradshaw. The request form bears your signature. Standard operating procedures have been followed in the verification and processing of this record. Caroline felt a chill go down her spine. Her signature? However, she had never signed any life insurance-related paperwork. After a lengthy pause, the insurance agent resumed his conversation in a kind but sternly businesslike tone. Please visit our office to review the records if you suspect an error. We would be pleased to help you. Caroline inhaled deeply as she attempted to regain her composure. I'll check on it, yes, thank you. Her hands were still shaking a little when she put the phone down. Insurance for life's recipients. She is accompanied by her sister and mother. Caroline's thoughts started to come together, but she wasn't yet prepared to draw a conclusion. Perhaps it was merely an error. Someone might have faked her signature. However, who and why? She dismissed the gloomy thoughts with a shake of her head. Her family had spent more than a decade together. Hadn't she been the one looking after them all along? Despite her occasional laziness, Vanessa was the sister her mother loved, and her mother was always kind. They wouldn't act in this manner. This was not something they could accomplish. She reminded herself of that. Her heart was still pounding, though. When Caroline arrived home that night, her face remained composed. Regarding the phone call to her mother and sister, she remained silent, but she studied them silently during dinner. As kind as ever, her mother put extra food on her plate and inquired about her day. Vanessa sat slouched in the corner, staring at her phone and responding to calls with halting answers. Everything appeared to be typical, too typical. One thing, though, Caroline was unable to ignore: her mother's gaze. Something about the serenity in those eyes chilled her to the bone, as though she was aware that Caroline would never have any suspicions, as though she was positive Caroline would never find out, that she was only a piece in a scheme that had been hatched long ago. As usual, Caroline stayed at home and cleaned that weekend. The house was oddly silent when her mother and sister went shopping. Moments like this, when the room was all hers and she could work without interference and at her own pace, were what Caroline enjoyed. Carefully cleaning every surface, she began in the living room. After that, she carefully put everything back in its right place in the kitchen. She then made the decision to also clean Vanessa's room. Caroline didn't usually invade her sister's personal space. Caroline never wanted to start needless arguments, and Vanessa always regarded it as her personal territory. She couldn't ignore the mess, though, as she saw it today: clothes all over the floor, papers all over the desk. Reaching for the vacuum, she leaned down to remove the dust from under the bed. Her fingertips, however, came into contact with something cold and hard as she probed deeper. The laptop was dust-covered and ancient. Caroline scowled. Long ago, Vanessa received a new computer. It must have been a while since anyone remembered this one. Caroline wiped away the dust and hit the power button out of curiosity. The screen miraculously lit up even though she didn't expect it to. No password. Immediately, the desktop appeared, with an open message window directly in front of her. I had a group conversation with my family. Caroline blinked. She almost never checked this conversation, which was mostly used for communication between Vanessa and her mother. However, a spooky sensation began to creep into her chest as her gaze settled on the most recent texts. She scrolled through the older discussions by moving her fingertips over the trackpad. Then, she gasped at the sight of a single message. Hey, how much should we set Caroline's insurance for? As high as possible, but we need to increase it gradually so it doesn't look suspicious. Until then, just use her like an ATM. She has enough savings to take care of us. The blood in Caroline's veins froze. Was this a joke? She scrolled through more messages as her fingers moved more quickly. Every phrase struck her like a blade. I changed her bank account password already. She still hasn't noticed. We have updated the insurance beneficiary. The forged signature looks perfect. If we poison her little by little, the doctors will just think it's a health issue. Her birthday next month is the perfect timing. Caroline's heart was pounding rapidly. In 2 weeks was her birthday. Her stomach churned. She reminisced about the evenings after dinner when she had felt unwell. These were the times when the carbon monoxide alarm had sounded without any apparent reason. The moment she discovered her car's brakes weren't working properly, it wasn't all random. Mom, her sister, she had never trusted anyone else. They intended to murder her. Caroline almost dropped the laptop to the ground because her hands were shaking so badly. She tried to stabilize herself by squeezing her eyes shut, but her thoughts were all over the place. This isn't possible. This wasn't something she could tolerate. The messages displayed on the screen, however, were indisputable evidence. A tiny sound, the front door opening, came from the living room. Vanessa was at home with her mother. With a start, Caroline quickly closed the laptop and tucked it back under the bed. "Where are you, Caroline?" the voice of her mother yelled. She inhaled deeply while trying to sound normal. "I'm tidying Vanessa's room." She made an effort to speak informally, but something had changed. As always, her mother smiled softly as she peered inside the room. "Thanks, sweetheart, but let Vanessa handle things on her own." "You don't have to." Caroline tried to smile back, but she knew it was impossible to conceal the terror that was beginning to seep into her. Because she was aware of the reality now. People who wished her dead lived with her. She also needed to figure out how to get out. With her back against the locked door, Caroline sat in her room. Her hands were still shaking from pushing Vanessa's laptop back under the bed, and she was breathing heavily. She had just read what? Mom, her sister, the very individual she had dedicated her life to caring for, defending, and supporting. They intended to murder her. Squeezing her eyes shut, she attempted to control the tremors that were beginning to shake her. No, this isn't possible. There must have been a problem. Perhaps she didn't understand? Perhaps that was merely a mean joke? However, a tiny voice murmured in her head, "No, Caroline, there's no mistake. The peculiar symptoms have persisted for several weeks. The inexplicable stomach aches. The carbon monoxide sirens are activated. The brakes on her car are broken. It was all true. People who wished her dead lived with her." Caroline balled her hands into fists. She was aware that she couldn't face them head on. If she made a direct accusation, they would be ready with 1,000 justifications. She wouldn't have much time left if she displayed fear, since they would know she was aware of the reality. She had to go. This evening, her life's longest night, Caroline made herself behave normally during the meal. As usual, she sat at the table and silently picked up her chopsticks. With a gentle smile, her mother put a piece of braised pork into her bowl. "Caroline, the first prepared your favorite meal today." Hesitantly, she glanced down at her bowl. She felt a creep of mute horror. Was there poison in the food? She took a dry gulp. She wondered how often her mother had said that. She had always eaten without thinking about it, until now. How many times had she blindly trusted someone and unknowingly poisoned herself? She put down her chopsticks and made a fake grimace. "I'm not feeling well. I doubt I'll be able to eat much." Her mother's head cocked. "What is the matter? You appeared to be doing well this morning." "Probably just too much work." Vanessa murmured something under her breath, while remaining engrossed in her phone. Caroline's countenance remained neutral as she merely nodded. She was shaking from head to toe. She was unable to eat. She was unable to consume alcohol. She needed to protect herself till she could get away. Getting ready to flee, Caroline went back to her room and shut the door. Sitting quietly in the dark and listening to the sounds outside, she dared not turn on the lights. Steps, gentle whispers. From the living room, the television was humming. Vanessa and her mother were still up. She waited with her eyes closed. Awaited the night's descent into silence. The home finally became quiet at midnight. Caroline got up gingerly and picked up the little bag she had made earlier. She was only allowed to take what was absolutely necessary: wallet, recognition, a little money, coal. She was afraid that her mother and Vanessa would track her transactions if she brought her bank cards. When she was ready, she went to her desk and grabbed a pen and some paper. She was aware that they would become suspicious right away. if she departed without saying anything. She wrote with shaking fingers, "I have an urgent task at work tomorrow morning. I might be home late. Don't wait for dinner." Just enough of a message to prevent them from worrying. After setting the note on the table, she inhaled deeply. It was time to get out. Leaving Hell, Caroline cautiously opened the door to her bedroom and went outside. It was dark inside the house. Her heart thumping against her ribs, she walked down the corridor. They might be awakened by any sound, no matter how tiny. Unconsciously, she held her breath as she passed her mother's chamber. The door stood open a little. From inside, a faint light poured out from the bedside lamp. Caroline caught a glimpse of Elizabeth's silhouette. Her mother was soundly asleep. She continued to walk. She was directly in front of the entrance door. Slowly, she turned the lock, gently, with caution. The latch slid silently and easily. She felt the cold night wind against her face as the door opened. Caroline shuddered. For a final glance at the house, she turned around. She had dedicated her entire life to developing the house, the location where she had thought she belonged. It had never been home, though. After inhaling deeply, she went outside, and she was not returning this time. Caroline's flimsy coat provided little shelter from the late-night chill as she hurried down the pitch-black street. She didn't care, though. She walked with a heavy gait, not from fatigue but from the oppressive terror that held her. She had gotten away. She wasn't yet safe, though. As soon as morning arrived, Vanessa and her mother would know she was gone. And what would they do if it occurred? Give her a call? Look for her? File a missing persons report? No. No one would call the police. They weren't mourning the death of a relative. It was they who plotted her murder. As the idea crossed Caroline's head, she shuddered. She needed to take action before they could. The initial steps toward freedom. Caroline visited a local ATM before departing Cleveland. She needed money. She couldn't tell her mother or Vanessa where she was, and any internet banking transactions could be tracked. The glowing ATM screen in the dark reflected her pale face. $500, the maximum withdrawal amount. She waited after pressing the button. A tiny stack of banknotes slid out of the machine as it whirred, and the gears clicked inside. She snatched them up and stuffed them in her pocket while looking around. Nobody. She still felt as though someone was watching her, though. The old phone vibrated in her pocket. Caroline bit her lip. She recognized the person. Mom. She was afraid to respond. Rather, she took out the SIM card, threw it in the garbage can next to her, and hurried off. Those calls would no longer bind her from now on. Destination: Minnesota's Duluth. The bus station was Caroline's next stop. She was unable to fly because she needed identification, and her mother may file a missing persons report to stop her from leaving the state. The bus was the most secure choice. Even though it was late, the ticket counter remained open. She took a step forward, her voice a little shaky. The journey to Duluth, Minnesota, required only one ticket. This is the first departure from the airport. Perhaps observing her weary face, the ticket clerk gave her a quick glance before tapping a few buttons on the screen. At 9 in the morning, the earliest bus departs. Tomorrow, 9 a.m. She was unable to wait this long. After saying thank you, Caroline bought the ticket and walked out of the station. She needed a spot to spend the night hidden away. This is not a hotel. No lodgings. Somewhere Vanessa and her mother would never consider searching. After wandering the streets for a while, she came into a coffee shop that was open all day. It was warm enough for her to sit for a few hours without drawing notice, yet it wasn't ostentatious or packed. She entered, located a peaceful nook, and ordered a hot cup of coffee. She let herself inhale deeply for the first time in hours. A disclosure to the one person she could rely on, the only person Caroline could rely on in Duluth, Minnesota, was her grandma, Martha Williams. However, they hadn't communicated for more than a decade. Caroline took out her newly purchased phone and phoned a number she had learned since she was a young girl. The phone rang. One time, twice, 3 times, etc. "Hi?" Through the receiver came an elderly but powerful voice. Caroline's throat became constricted. She had assumed the voice would never again. "I'm Caroline, Grandma." A few seconds of silence. A gentle sigh of relief followed. Caroline, oh, my darling kid. You're phoning me at this hour, but why? What's the matter? Caroline felt the sting of tears as she closed her eyes. It never occurred to her that she would have to utter these words. I'm not sure what to do, Grandma. I need assistance. I'm unable to be here any longer. I believe that Mom and Vanessa are plotting my murder. She spoke in a phrase that was definite and irrevocable, bringing her down into the pain of the truth she had just acknowledged. On the other end of the telephone there was silence. Her grandmother's voice then grew quiet, calm, and unfrightened. Where are you? In Cleveland, I am. Tomorrow morning, I have a bus ticket to Duluth. Martha's breath came out, but this time it was a sigh of resolve. Hear me out, Caroline. Board that bus. As soon as you can, come here. You'll stay with me when you get there. Together, we will solve this. Caroline's throat became constricted. You think I'm telling the truth? Caroline, my stupid child, Martha remarked resolutely. I have always trusted you. Caroline started crying. Finally, after all these years, someone who didn't blame her, didn't doubt her, and didn't ask her to explain. She was someone who just took her word for it. Caroline was sitting in the quiet cafe that evening, with her hands encircling a chilly cup of coffee. But there was hope in her heart for the first time in what seemed like an eternity. She would leave this town tomorrow morning. She was going to start a new life tomorrow morning. And she refused to let anyone take it away from her this time. The bus left Cleveland behind, carrying a woman whose heart was damaged but still beating, and the sky was a drab grey as it drove down the highway, pulling her cloak tighter around her, as though it could protect her from the storm raging inside her. Caroline sat nestled away in a corner seat. All night, she hadn't slept. Rather, she had gazed out the window, seeing the road signs and trees as they vanished into the night. She had gotten out of that house. Was she really safe, though? Minnesota's Duluth. Her grandmother was waiting over there. The only person on the planet who had trusted her right away. Was that sufficient, though? By now, Vanessa and her mother would have discovered her absence. Perhaps they were desperately phoning her, looking for her, or worse, making up a narrative to report her missing to the police right now. What if they found her before she could tell the truth? Caroline's fingers were freezing as she balled her hands into fists. She couldn't allow that to occur. She refused to allow them to control her once more. Dawn had just broken as the bus arrived at the Duluth station. The cold air pricked Caroline's skin as she got off. She tightened her cloak around herself while looking around for someone she knew. Then she caught sight of her. Martha Williams, her grandmother, stood firm and small amidst the fierce storm. Her silver hair was gently tossed by the wind, and her grandmother's eyes glowed with emotion as they locked gaze. Martha opened her arms without a word. With heated tears streaming down her cheeks, Caroline rushed to her and buried her face into her weak shoulders. Grandma, I'm really afraid. Martha's wrinkled hand caressed her back, holding her even tighter. Don't worry, kid. You arrived here. You are now secure. However, they were both aware that safety was a fleeting state. Caroline required more than a hiding place. Justice was what she needed. Pursuing justice, Martha immediately contacted Thomas Henderson, a retired lawyer with extensive connections and an old friend. With salt and pepper hair and piercing, analytical eyes, Thomas was in his 60s. He listened to Caroline's narrative without saying anything, only nodding now and then. Do you possess any proof? At last, he inquired. Caroline shuddered. Proof. She was so hurried that she failed to bring Vanessa's laptop with her. However, she quickly reached for her phone and opened her photo album. And there they were, screenshots of the messages from Vanessa's laptop that described the exact steps involved in the murderous plot. Her hands trembled as she handed the phone to Thomas. He flipped through the pictures slowly and deliberately, looking at each one. His scowl grew with each screenshot. He finally sighed deeply and put the phone down. What are our options? Martha inquired, her voice tense with anxiety. Thomas folded his arms. We'll report this to the authorities. However, I must caution you it won't be simple. What are you saying? Caroline's throat constricted as she asked. Thomas gave her a serious look as he glanced at her. You have communications. but no tangible proof. Your mother and sister might easily fabricate another tale if they deny everything. Do you know whether this is something they have done before? Caroline trembled. Elizabeth, her mother, had always been a cunning individual. She would definitely try to change the circumstances if she were in a tight spot. What should I do now? She inquired. Thomas drummed the desk with his fingers. We require additional evidence. Are you aware of their financial circumstances? Caroline blinked. Cash. Naturally. Vanessa and her mother were constantly in need of money. They might discover strange transactions or even records of the life insurance beneficiary change if they looked into their bank accounts. Are you able to go into your bank account? Thomas inquired. With a nod, Caroline hurriedly launched her banking app. Then she stopped. The balance of the account is $0. All of the money she had saved was gone. Her hands shaking, she swallowed deeply. Everything was taken. After giving her a quick glance, Thomas nodded. Financial abuse is another charge we have. He got up and grabbed his coat. Come with me, Martha, Caroline. Now is the moment to call the cops. Thomas presented the complete case to the investigating officer at the police station. The officer initially appeared doubtful. However, after reviewing the financial records and the messages, he was notified by the insurance company that Caroline's signature was fake. The decision. The officer's expression grew gloomy. We will contact Cleveland PD immediately. An official investigation was started in a matter of hours. Elizabeth's and Vanessa's home was raided by Cleveland police 2 days later. They confiscated Vanessa's laptop. The entire conspiracy to poison Caroline, the fake documents, and her search history were all found. The evidence could no longer be denied. Vanessa and Elizabeth were immediately taken into custody. Caroline had not seen her mother since she ran away until she entered the interrogation room. Elizabeth looked up with icy, unblinking eyes. You really are a traitor. Caroline looked up at her. You betrayed me first. Nothing else could be said. Justice was done. The trial went quickly. The jury swiftly rendered a decision after considering the overwhelming evidence. Elizabeth received a 15-year prison sentence. Vanessa was sentenced to 8 years in prison. Caroline closed her eyes while the judge read the punishment. At last, following everything, she really was free. The majority of the throng had already left, with only a few whispers remaining as the courthouse doors opened to show the lengthy hallway beyond. As Caroline stepped outside, she felt as if a burden that had been pressing down on her chest for years had been lifted. Elizabeth Bradshaw, her mother, received a 15-year term. She formerly adored her sister, Vanessa, without conditions, but she spent 8 years in prison. But was she at ease after that? Not totally, because they were still her family, no matter what. Regardless, there had been a moment when she trusted them more than anybody else in the world and loved them without conditions. However, that love and that trust had been ripped apart. A hand lay softly on her shoulder, wrinkled and warm. Are you all right, dear? Caroline turned to see her grandma, Martha, staring at her with blue, worried eyes. She inhaled deeply before nodding gently. I'm okay. I really am. She spoke it and believed it for the first time in years. Making a fresh start, Caroline moved in with Martha following the trial. The only location she felt comfortable in was Duluth, Minnesota, which she had previously considered foreign. However, it wasn't simple to start afresh. She was unemployed. She had no money in her bank account. She was still plagued by the betrayal memories every night. She would simply sit at the window and gaze at the wide winter sky throughout the first few weeks. She was surprised to find Duluth freezing. Rooftops were covered with snow, and frigid winds roared through door cracks. However, the fireplace in Martha's tiny home was burning continuously, providing warmth to the room. Martha would prepare tea each morning, take a seat across from her at the kitchen table, and gently inquire, "What would you like to do today?" Caroline initially merely shook her head. However, she gradually rediscovered herself as the days went by. She entered the municipal library one day. She had always been an avid reader. She had found refuge within the pages of the library as a child. She applied for a small job, helping guests and reshelving books. But that was a start for her. It was a start she made for herself, not one that was imposed on her. The letter A letter came 3 months after the trial. Jonathan Bradshaw sent the message. Her fingers clenched on the envelope as she froze for a second. The man who abandoned their family over 15 years ago was her father. The letter was succinct. Caroline first apologized. I wish to see you just once, even though I know that words cannot make up for what I did. Give me a chance if you're willing. I love you. Jonathan. Caroline sat for a long time without saying anything. She used to despise him because she thought he had abandoned her. She was stuck with a domineering mother and a phony family. However, Caroline came to a realization after discovering the truth about Elizabeth, including what she had done to him and what she may have done to her had she not escaped. Not everyone has the strength to oppose someone like that. Her dad wasn't strong enough to keep her alive. However, perhaps it was time to give him a second shot. A second opportunity. In a tiny cafe that day, Caroline ran across her father, whom she hadn't seen in 50 years. She had forgotten how old he was. His hair was streaked with grey, and his eyes were deep with fatigue. However, his eyes were filled with love and sadness when he saw her. Hours passed while they conversed. Not everything was flawless right away. However, it was a beginning. Caroline will not let the past prevent her from pursuing her future this time. After 2 years, Caroline's life had taken a radical turn. She was no longer the lady stuck in a family without affection. She now held a steady job at the library. She was able to grin once more. There would be no need for her to fear betrayal. Above all, she had discovered contentment. Martin David. She had met a history teacher who had visited the library in quest of study materials. She had initially been fearful of being harmed once more. She had never encountered anyone like David, though. He had patience. Nice. Most significantly, he never immediately asked her to trust him. He simply waited for her till she was ready. She realized one day that she wanted to let him into her heart. The day of the wedding, on a lovely spring afternoon, Caroline got married. Winter was over. In Martha's yard, the flowers had already started to open. Caroline, wearing a white bridal gown, stood in front of the mirror. The lady in the reflection was powerful and vibrant, and she nearly failed to identify her. Martha entered the room with a soft smile. Are you content, Caroline? Caroline felt her chest lighten as she gazed into her grandmother's eyes. Yes, Grandma said. For the first time, I'm genuinely joyful. For the first time in years, her father was waiting outside, prepared to accompany her down the aisle. She had changed from being a helpless girl. She had moved on from the past. She was starting a new life today, one she had created for herself, surrounded by people who genuinely cared about her. And her true family was there.